There is a specific kind of silence that does not bring peace. Instead, it signals a storm gathering strength behind the fortress-like stone walls of Buckingham Palace. For months, the world has held its breath, watching every movement from the royal court, hoping for a sign, a look, or even a brief, honest update on the most beloved woman in the British monarchy, Catherine, the Princess of Wales. But all they received were empty frames, staged photographs, and vague explanations from the palace's meticulously controlled media machine. However, the moment we are witnessing today is unlike any scripted narrative that has come before. Kate has broken her silence. This is not a PR-managed announcement or a forced smile for the cameras. It is an explosion of truth, a moment where the mask of royal perfection has finally slipped, revealing deep fractures and pains that can no longer be hidden from the public eye. Look closely at the eyes of Prince William. For the first time in modern history, the heir to the throne, a man trained from birth to maintain a stiff upper lip regardless of the circumstances, has been seen in tears. Those tears are not just born from the anxiety over his wife's health. They carry the crushing weight of a final secret that has been forced into the light. A secret the palace swore to protect at any cost, but one that is now threatening to shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Why did the silence last so long? And what was powerful enough to make Kate decide that it is time the world knows? To understand this, we must return to the sleepless nights at Windsor, where the boundary between royal duty and personal survival became thinner than ever before. We often think of the royals as the ones controlling the game, but in this scenario, it seems the insiders themselves were trapped in a labyrinth of lies and total control. This final secret is about more than just an illness. It is about power, betrayal, and the heavy price a woman must pay when trying to prevent an ancient institution from collapsing under its own weight. When Kate speaks, it is not just words. It is an act of liberation. And William, caught between his loyalty to the crown and his love for a woman on the edge, has been forced to confront the most devastating truth of his life. The media storm that is about to hit will be like nothing we have ever seen. This is no longer about edited photos or social media rumors. This is the moment of raw, unvarnished reality. A new, haunting, and dramatic chapter of the British royal family has officially begun. A chapter where the tears of a future king serve as the ultimate evidence of the end of an era of dark secrets. The atmosphere inside Adelaide Cottage had shifted from a place of recovery to a bunker of high-stakes negotiations. For weeks, the public was fed a diet of planned procedures and successful surgeries. But behind the heavy oak doors, the reality was unraveling. William, usually the pillar of the institution, found himself pacing the corridors, caught in a bitter tug-of-war between his role as the future king and his soul as a husband. The palace's traditional strategy of never complain, never explain was no longer a shield. It had become a cage. While the world dissected a single grainy photograph, a much darker realization was dawning on the inner circle. The secrecy protocol was failing. It wasn't just about a medical update anymore. It was about the survival of a narrative that the monarchy is invincible. Kate, who had spent over a decade perfecting the art of royal poise, was now the one questioning the very cogs of the machine she had helped maintain. The friction between Kensington Palace and the king's advisors reached a boiling point during a private meeting that many insiders describe as the night the peace broke. Reports suggest that a specific email, labeled with the chilling subject line, "She deserves more than silence," was circulated among top-tier aides. It was a demand for honesty, a plea to stop the spin before the public's trust vanished forever. But the institution is an ancient beast, slow to change and terrified of vulnerability. Every time William suggested a more transparent approach, he was met with the same wall of protocol. The public cannot handle the full truth yet. This was the moment the heir realized that the crown he would one day wear was currently acting as a gag on the woman he loved. The pressure didn't just come from the outside. It was leaking from within. Whispers from medical staff and whispers in the hallowed halls of Windsor began to paint a picture far more complex than a simple recovery. There was talk of unexpected complications and a timeline that didn't add up. The palace was trying to control reality, but reality was breaking through the floorboards. In the center of this storm sat Kate, watching as the institution prioritized its image over her humanity. It was here, in the cold light of a Windsor morning, that she realized that if the truth was ever going to be told, she would have to be the one to tell it, no matter the cost to the crown's carefully curated mystique. The secret was too heavy to carry alone, and the tears William shed were the first signs that the weight was finally becoming unbearable. The strategy of calculated silence had finally reached its breaking point. As the sun set over the long walk at Windsor, the ivory tower of royal communication began to crumble under the weight of its own deception. It was no longer a question of if the truth would come out, but how much damage it would do when it finally shattered the glass. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of panic management and the realization that they had lost control of the narrative. William's tears, witnessed by a select few in the private corridors, were the physical manifestation of a system reaching its limit. For years, he had been the protector of the royal image, the one who believed that the institution must remain impenetrable to survive. But as he stood by Kate's bedside, he saw a woman far sicker, for far longer, than any official statement had dared to hint. The planned and successful surgery was a phrase that now felt like a bitter lie, a piece of palace spin that was currently suffocating the family. The tension between the king's advisors and the Wales's inner circle turned into an open conflict. Aides whispered about unexpected complications that had turned a routine recovery into a fight for survival. The leaked files, the whispers that someone within the medical team had dared to speak out, sent shockwaves through the royal offices. The palace machine, which had always prioritized stability over transparency, was now being exposed as more afraid of the truth than of a scandal. In this moment of total institutional failure, a dramatic shift occurred. King Charles, witnessing the raw suffering of his daughter-in-law and the breaking spirit of his heir, decided to drop the guard. He realized that a monarchy that hides its humanity behind polished lines eventually loses the very people it serves. The secret was no longer just a medical chart. It was a test of survival for the entire institution. Kate, watching the chaos from behind the velvet curtains, made a silent vow. She saw that the protocol was failing her children, her husband, and herself. If the palace wouldn't tell the truth, she would have to reset the monarchy herself. The final secret was about to be dragged into the light, not by a leak, but by an act of honest vulnerability that the royal machine never could have manufactured. The internal war at Windsor reached a definitive turning point when King Charles himself stepped into the line of fire. Witnessing Kate's fragile state and the visible unraveling of his son, William, the king realized that the palace machine had pushed the strategy of secrecy to a dangerous extreme. Charles, a man who has lived his entire life governed by rigid protocol, saw something at Kate's bedside that terrified him more than any negative headline. It was the moment the sovereign decided that the institution must either adapt or break. Reports from inside the royal offices suggest that Charles broke the machine with a single, thunderous directive: no more hiding. He overruled his senior advisors, those who had spent decades perfecting the art of managing the optics. The king understood that the public's growing mistrust was not just a PR crisis. It was a survival test for the crown itself. He saw that the planned and successful narrative was no longer a shield. It was a lie that was suffocating his family. The atmosphere at the palace shifted instantly from panic management to a grim preparation for total transparency. This wasn't a choice made for the sake of media convenience. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim the truth before it was dragged out by leaked emails and hospital rumors. William, though shaken and in tears, found a sliver of relief in his father's decisiveness. The heir realized that he could no longer protect Kate by keeping her in the shadows. The light was the only thing that could save her from the encroaching conspiracy theories. In those quiet hours, the decision was finalized. The palace would drop its guard. They would stop pretending that everything was fine, while a future queen was fighting a battle the world couldn't see. This was the turning point, the moment the most carefully controlled institution in Britain admitted it was human. But as the king gave the order to prepare the world for the news, he knew that once the veil was lifted, the fairy tale monarchy would be gone forever, replaced by a raw, mortal reality. The time for polished palace lines and vague updates had come to a definitive end. Behind the closed doors of Adelaide Cottage, Kate made a choice that the royal machine never could have manufactured on its own. She decided to give the world her honest vulnerability. It was a decision born not of royal protocol, but of a mother's need to protect her children and a princess's need to reclaim her own story. The 94-second video message was not a result of a high-end production crew. It was a raw, fragile moment filmed in a garden, away from the cold marble halls of Buckingham Palace. When the camera started rolling, the world finally saw what had been missing for months. The real Kate, not a staged photograph or a distant silhouette. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of a secret that had nearly slipped away. In this moment, the palace spin was completely dismantled. She didn't use the regal we or talk in institutional platitudes. She spoke as a woman, a wife, and a mother who had just been diagnosed with cancer. The planned and successful narrative that the palace had clung to for so long was finally exposed as a desperate shield. William, standing just out of sight of the lens, was described by insiders as a man broken by the honesty of his wife's words. For months, he had been part of the system that tried to control reality, but as he watched Kate admit to the cameras that she was far sicker than anyone in power wanted to say out loud, the heir finally understood the cost of silence. This wasn't just a health update. It was a turning point for the monarchy. By speaking directly to the people, Kate bypassed the palace gatekeepers and gave the public the one thing the institution had failed to provide: the truth. The secret was out, but it wasn't dragged out by the media. It was offered by the princess herself, resetting the monarchy's script and forcing an ancient institution to finally admit it can bleed. The relief that swept through the global headlines following the announcement of Kate's remission was instantaneous. But inside the palace, the mood remained far more complex. This wasn't a return to the status quo. It was the beginning of a fragile future. Remission, as the palace insiders knew, was not a definitive cure, and the shadow of uncertainty continued to hang over every royal engagement. The monarchy had been forced to admit its mortality, and the fairy tale script had been permanently rewritten. The announcement of her recovery was a moment the world clung to like a lifeline. Yet the palace was already preparing for a reality where a future queen might have to step away to survive. The Kate crisis had exposed a critical weakness. An ancient institution that depends so heavily on a single humanized face becomes incredibly vulnerable when that person falls ill. Protocol was no longer about managing appearances. It was now about contingency plans and survival. William, though relieved, remained visibly marked by the ordeal. The tears he shed during the darkest months of the secrecy had transformed into a grim resolve. He had watched the palace machine prioritize optics over his wife's humanity, and he was determined that such a failure of transparency would never happen again. The rift between the heir and the traditional gatekeepers of the monarchy had deepened. He now saw the palace spin not as a protector, but as a threat. For the public, the remission update was a victory, but the hard questions about secrecy and trust remained. The palace had been forced to admit it can bleed, and the trust that was dragged out at the last possible moment would take years to rebuild. The monarchy was no longer just managing feelings. It was struggling to manage its own perception in a world that had watched a princess suffer in real time. Kate's legacy was already taking shape, defined not by royal duty, but by honest vulnerability. She had given the people something the palace machine never could: a glimpse behind the velvet curtains at the human cost of the crown. As she began her slow return to public life, it was clear that she wasn't just recovering her health. She was resetting the rules of how the monarchy would interact with the 21st century. The Kate crisis did more than just reveal a medical secret. It forced a centuries-old institution to finally admit it is mortal. For generations, the British monarchy relied on a facade of being impenetrable, a structure where the royals were symbols first and humans second. But as the walls of Windsor echoed with the reality of illness, that ancient armor shattered. The palace was no longer just dealing with a family tragedy. It was facing a test of survival for the entire institution. A new, grim protocol began to take shape behind the scenes. Senior advisors were forced to draft contingency plans for a future where a queen might be step away to survive. The concept of royal duty was being fundamentally rewritten to include human vulnerability. Health was no longer seen as optional background noise, but as a critical factor in the crown's political and institutional stability. This shift from invincibility to humanity carries massive political consequences. When a monarchy functions primarily through the humanization of the regime by a few central figures like Kate, their absence creates a vacuum that the palace machine cannot fill with polished statements. William, witnessing this firsthand, has become the architect of a more mortal monarchy. He understands that for the crown to survive in the 21st century, it must stop pretending that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The final secret being dragged into the light was the realization that the institution's greatest strength, its mystery, had become its greatest liability. By trying to control reality, the palace had nearly lost the public's trust. Now, they are forced to navigate a world that has seen them bleed, cry, and struggle. The fairy tale is over. What remains is a public institution desperately trying to prove it can still rule while admitting it is just as fragile as the people it serves. As Princess Kate began her slow emergence back into the public eye, it became clear that her illness had left an indelible mark on the crown. Her legacy was no longer just about fashion or royal poise. It had become a battleground between humanity and the institution. By choosing to speak with honest vulnerability, she provided something the palace machine, with all its power and resources, never could: a soul. She transformed her private pain into a global model of empathy, exposing the coldness of the very system she was destined to lead. This shift was most evident in the letters she began to pen. Not just official proclamations, but messages to her children and the public that spoke of survival, mental health, and the importance of early childhood. She was no longer just a princess-style figure standing behind a window. She was a woman who had reset the monarchy by prioritizing her role as a mother over the demands of the royal calendar. This was a quiet rebellion against a protocol that had historically viewed human needs as a distraction from the business of the crown. Inside the palace, the Kate effect was forcing a restructuring of how the monarchy approaches its charitable work. The focus moved from grand, distant patronages to ground-level issues of human vulnerability. Kate's illness became a test case for whether an ancient institution could adapt to the 21st century's demand for authenticity. She proved that the monarchy's survival does not depend on being untouchable, but on being relatable. William, standing by her side, has become the protector of this new, more human legacy. He has seen the cost of the old ways, the tears, the secrecy, and the failed palace statements. As he prepares for his own future on the throne, his vision is now shaped by Kate's 94-second confession, a moment that rewrote the monarchy's script and proved that truth is the only foundation that can withstand a crisis. The final secret was out. The crown is only as strong as the humans who wear it. The fallout from the Kate crisis extends far beyond the palace gates. It has become a fundamental test of modern monarchy and the public's relationship with the crown. For decades, the British monarchy was consumed by the world as a harmless fairy tale. But the months of absolute silence followed by staged photographs have forced the public to ask hard questions about secrecy, power, and the manipulation of truth. This wasn't just about a medical update. It was a revelation of how an ancient institution tried to control reality itself when faced with raw human vulnerability. The impact on public trust has been profound. People who fund this institution with their attention and their taxes are no longer satisfied being fed polished palace lines without any real context. The global debate has shifted from simple curiosity to a critical examination of institutional ethics. Is a system that prioritizes optics over transparency still fit for the 21st century? Every time the palace chose secrecy as a shield to manage perception, it inadvertently fueled a wildfire of conspiracy that nearly consumed the crown's credibility. For the viewer, this story serves as a dark case study for how we consume royal narratives. It forces us to distinguish between respecting a sick woman's privacy and a public institution hiding the condition of its central symbolic figure, to maintain a facade of invincibility. The Kate legacy is now a permanent reminder that health and truth are not optional background noise. They are the survival factors for any institution built on the humanization of power. William and Charles now face a monarchy that has been forced to admit it can bleed. They must navigate a future where the fairy tale is dead, replaced by a fragile system that must prove its worth through honest vulnerability rather than calculated silence. The final secret has been dragged into the light. The monarchy's survival in a digital, skeptical world depends entirely on its ability to admit when the machine breaks behind those ancient palace walls. The saga of Princess Kate's final secret has reached its resolution, but the institution it leaves behind is forever changed. This wasn't just a story about a princess fighting a personal battle with cancer. It was the moment a centuries-old system was finally forced to admit it could bleed. The fairy tale monarchy that thrived on mystery and an aura of invincibility has been dismantled, replaced by a raw, mortal reality that the public saw in real time. Kate didn't just update her medical chart. She effectively rewrote the monarchy's script. By pushing back against the palace machine and choosing honest vulnerability over calculated spin, she gave the institution a human soul that it had desperately lacked. Her legacy is now a model of pushback done right, being human and honest while still demanding the right to survive on one's own terms. For King Charles and Prince William, the lesson of these months is clear. Silence in a public institution is a dangerous liability. If the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched its most beloved figure suffer behind a wall of secrecy, it can never go back to pretending that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The final secret has been dragged into the light. The crown is not a harmless fairy tale, but a fragile institution made of flesh and blood. As the dust settles, we are left with a monarchy that is more fragile, yet perhaps more resilient because it has been humanized by crisis. The tears shed by William and the resolve shown by Charles represent an awakening, a realization that health and truth are not optional, but essential for survival in the 21st century. The fairy tale is over, and in its place stands a mortal crown, finally forced to be as honest as the people it serves.